In August 2017, a deep-sea submersible, funded by Paul Allen's research team, dropped through 3.5 miles of black water in the Philippine Sea, its cameras and sonar probing the abyssal plain where sunlight has never penetrated. What the remotely operated vehicle found resting at 18,000 feet, where the pressure tops 5,000 pounds per square inch, was the USS Indianapolis, her hull split open like a gutted fish, her bow sheared clean away, her secrets sealed in crushing darkness for 72 years. But the real story wasn't in the wreckage. It was in what happened after she went down. 12 minutes to sink, 4 days to die, 900 men scattered across miles of shark-infested ocean, and no one in authority realized they were missing. This is the story of the USS Indianapolis, and it begins not with the sinking but with a cargo so secret that even the men hauling it aboard had no idea what they were carrying. July 1945. The war in the Pacific is grinding toward its bloody conclusion, though the final blow, the one that will end it, has not yet been struck. At the naval shipyard at Hunters Point, California, a Portland-class heavy cruiser called the USS Indianapolis lies alongside the pier, taking on cargo under armed guard. The sailors watching the crates swing aboard know only one thing: whatever's in those boxes, somebody very important wants it delivered fast. 610 feet of welded steel, just under 10,000 tons displacement, a crew of nearly 1,200 men, and orders to make speed like she's outrunning the devil himself. On July 16, Captain Charles B. McVay III gives the order, and the Indianapolis eases away from San Francisco. Her engines wind up to 29 knots, a blistering, hull-shaking pace that eats the 2,400 miles to Pearl Harbor in just over 3 days. Even in Pearl Harbor, where she stops briefly to refuel, no one asks questions. In wartime, you do not ask questions. When admirals are watching the clock and Marine guards stand watch over sealed crates lash down on your main deck. When the Indianapolis leaves Pearl on July 19, she pushes even harder, racing southwest across the open Pacific toward a small island in the Marianas called Tinian. She arrives on July 26 and offloads her mysterious cargo in a matter of hours, under conditions so secret that the receiving officers will not speak of it for decades. It will be years before the crew learns the truth. They had carried components for Little Boy, the atomic bomb that would vaporize Hiroshima, just 10 days later and change warfare forever. For now, in late July 1945, there is no ceremony, no congratulations, no acknowledgement of what they have just done, only new orders typed on flimsy paper and handed to Captain McVay in a sealed envelope. Proceed to Guam for resupply. Then continue to Leyte Gulf in the Philippines to join a large naval formation designated Task Force 95 for training exercises ahead of the planned invasion of Japan. So, on the morning of July 28, the Indianapolis departs Guam, sailing alone. No escort, no destroyer screen, no submarine protection. Steaming northwest at a comfortable 17 knots through a sea that looks deceptively calm under the tropical sun. Captain McVay stands on the bridge as the afternoon of July 29 bleeds into evening, watching the weather deteriorate with the kind of slow unease that only years at sea can teach. The salt air cools against his skin as the tropical heat gives way to the uncertainty of nightfall. Heavy swells are rolling in from storms far to the north. Cloud cover thickens and thins in ragged cycles. Visibility swings from reasonable to nearly zero every few minutes as the moon breaks through, then disappears behind the clouds again. The routing orders he received at Guam are standard for an unescorted combatant. Maintain 15.7 knots. Zigzag at your discretion when weather and visibility permit. Arrive Leyte Gulf by 1100 hours on July 31. As the evening wears on and visibility continues to worsen, McVeigh makes a tactical decision that will haunt him for the rest of his life. He orders the zigzag pattern discontinued. Those defensive course changes designed to make torpedo targeting nearly impossible are now, in his judgment, more likely to cause a navigation error or collision in the murk than to protect against a submarine his briefings say is unlikely to be there at all. He is operating fully within his authority, following his written orders to the letter, making exactly the kind of judgment call that commanding officers are paid to make at sea. What Captain McVeigh does not know, what no one has told him because Navy intelligence has classified this entire route as presenting negligible submarine threat, is that 1,500 meters off his starboard beam just below the surface, Commander Makitsura Hashimoto is raising the periscope of Japanese submarine I-58 for a look at the night. Through a brief tear in the cloud cover, Hashimoto catches the outline of a large warship against the moonlit horizon, dark, unmistakable, running straight and steady. He orders his submarine down to attack depth and begins to maneuver into firing position, estimating speed, bearing, and range with the practiced efficiency of a hunter who has been stalking these waters for weeks. The Indianapolis steams on, her crew rotating through normal watch stations, men sleeping on the open decks to escape the suffocating heat below, officers checking their charts and plotting the course to Leyte, completely unaware that they have less than 2 hours to live as a ship. Shortly before midnight on July 29, Hashimoto gives the firing order. 6 Type 95 torpedoes roar out of their tubes in quick succession, each one carrying roughly 1,210 pounds of high explosive, running at 35 knots through black water toward the starboard side of the Indianapolis. The transit time is measured in seconds. On the bridge of the Indianapolis no one sees a thing. There is nothing to see in that darkness and confused sea state, only the familiar rhythm of a ship at night, the watch at their stations, the helmsman holding course, Captain McVeigh reading paperwork in his sea cabin. At exactly 0:14 hours on July 30, 1945, 14 minutes after midnight, the first torpedo smashes into the starboard bow of the Indianapolis with a burst of light so blinding it looks like the sun is rising in the wrong direction. Dr. Lewis Haynes, the ship's chief medical officer, is asleep in his quarters near the point of impact when that first torpedo detonates almost directly under his room. Years later he will describe it like this: I awoke. I was in the air. I saw a bright light before I felt the concussion of the explosion that threw me up in the air almost to the overhead. The blast rips him off his bunk, slams him into the ceiling and dumps him back onto the deck. Before he can understand what is happening, the second explosion hits. Hashimoto's spread has been deadly accurate. Of the 6 torpedoes fired, 2 find their target. The second strikes amidships, near the forward fire room and powder magazines. Approximately 1 minute after the first, the second detonation is catastrophically worse. It tears the ship nearly to the keel, ignites a 3,500-gallon aviation fuel tank on the main deck, and drives a column of fire straight up through the superstructure. Marine Sergeant Edgar Harrell, sleeping on the open deck to escape the heat below, watches the scene unfold from 40 feet away. The first torpedo hit 40 feet in front of me, cutting off the ship's bow. The second one caused a massive fire, and men came from below deck, screaming with scorched flesh. Dr. Haynes, trapped in the officer's wardroom, as fire races through the passageways, sees his neighbor Ken Stout step ahead of him into the main corridor. Stout yells, "Look out," and throws his hands up just as a wall of flame tears down the passage. Haynes lifts his life jacket to shield his face and steps back. The fire burns the hair off his head, sears his face and the backs of his hands. When he looks again, Ken Stout is simply gone, incinerated in an instant. Even as men die in the flames and the flooding compartments below, the Indianapolis herself is still trying to live, her engine still turning, her screws still biting water, her hull still mostly in one piece. The damage, though, is beyond anything she can endure. The first torpedo has effectively torn off the bow, flooding the forward compartments faster than any damage control team could possibly counter. The second has broken the ship at her weakest point, rupturing fuel tanks, igniting magazines, and destroying the structural spine that holds 600 feet of warship, together against the weight of the sea. Within seconds, almost all electrical power fails, plunging interior spaces into total darkness except where the fires burn. The internal communications system dies with it. Captain McVeigh's order to abandon ship, given only minutes after the torpedoes struck, based on immediate damage reports from his executive officer, never reaches most of the crew through official channels. Men below decks are left to grope their way out by instinct and blind panic, crawling through flooding compartments in pitch blackness, hunting for ladders that lead up while water pours down. Shipmates scream somewhere in the dark. The ship has already begun to list hard to starboard. The Indianapolis settles by the bow first. Her nose dips lower and lower as thousands of tons of seawater pour into the forward hull. The list to starboard increases with sickening speed, 10 degrees 20-40, until the men on the open deck can no longer stand without hanging on to rails and fittings. Captain McVeigh, having given the abandon ship order and confirmed that the radio room is trying to send a distress signal, moves quickly from the bridge toward the edge of the slanting deck. He knows, with the cold certainty all sea officers dread, that his ship is dying, and that he has minutes, perhaps less, to get into the water before she drags him down. The screws are still turning, now rising out of the water as the stern lifts, throwing a fan of spray that catches the moonlight like scattered silver. At approximately 0026 hours, around 12 minutes after the first torpedo struck, the Indianapolis rolls completely onto her starboard side. Her port hull now faces the sky. Her screws stand almost straight up out of the water, still spinning in the air. For one suspended, breathless instant, the whole ship hangs between surface and depth. Men trapped inside call for help they will never receive, their voices echoing through flooding steel compartments. Men already in the water watch in horror as the stern rises higher and higher, the entire 610-foot length of the ship tilting toward vertical before gravity and momentum finish what the torpedoes began. The bow, already deep, leads the plunge. The stern follows with a sound survivors later describe as a kind of metallic shriek, the death cry of a ship, steel tearing, trapped air exploding through ruptured seams, and then, with a final boil of water and oil, the USS Indianapolis vanishes beneath the surface of the Philippine Sea. Captain McVeigh, swimming hard away from the sinking hull to avoid being pulled down by the suction, feels hot oil and water wash over the back of his neck. He hears a final hiss of escaping air. When he turns to look, there is nothing left, only darkness, scattered debris, and a spreading slick of bunker fuel that will mark the grave for days. Roughly 300 men go down, with the ship, killed in the explosions, trapped below or dragged under by the sinking hull. Around 900 others make it into the water, scattered over several square miles of open ocean, clinging to life jackets and any wreckage that floats, bodies coated head to toe in thick black oil, completely unaware that no one ashore even realizes they are out here. When dawn breaks on July 30th, the men of the Indianapolis get their first clear view of their situation. What they see is this: water in every direction, scattered knots of survivors clinging to debris and Kapok life vests, bodies floating face down in the oil, an unbroken horizon offering not the slightest hint of rescue. Dr. Haynes, treading water in one of the larger groups, will later recall the scene this way: being in the water wasn't an unpleasant experience except that the black fuel oil got in your nose and eyes. We all looked the same, black oil all over, white eyes and red mouths, and you couldn't tell the doctor from the boot seaman. The fuel oil, as toxic and miserable as it is, brings one unexpected mercy. It coats almost every inch of exposed skin, forming a film that blunts the sun's rays and, oddly enough, prevents the massive sunburns that would otherwise disable many of the men within a few hours. But the oil has already been swallowed by nearly everyone during the panicked escape from the sinking ship and in the hours since. Soon men are retching, their bodies fighting desperately to get rid of the petroleum that lines their throats and stomachs. The water feels warm at first, about 85 degrees Fahrenheit, tropical, almost pleasant. But human body temperature is 98.6, and minute by minute, hour by hour, heat seeps away. Given enough time, even in warm seas, immersion means hypothermia. As the morning wears on, survivor groups form naturally. Men hearing familiar voices calling for shipmates gather into clusters for comfort and for simple survival. Ensign Harlan Twible, a recent Naval Academy graduate, takes a rough head count as the sun climbs. He makes a grim discovery: he is the only officer in his vicinity. That means he is now responsible for roughly 325 men, most of them looking at him for leadership, reassurance, and a plan he does not have. Years later, Twible will admit, "We tried to keep the men thinking that they would be saved, but there was no way in God's green earth that I knew we were going to be saved. My fear was really for the men, not for myself." He buries that fear and does his job. He organizes the men into defensive circles, tries to keep them close together, rations what few emergency rations they've salvaged, and projects an air of calm competence even as the hours unspool and no ship appears on the horizon. Captain McVeigh, floating in a small cluster with about 8 other men and a single battered raft, maintains command as best he can, making decisions about what little food and water they have, deciding who clings where, never setting aside the responsibility that comes with being the last commanding officer of a ship that no longer exists. As the sun climbs and the heat builds, the survivors fall into a grim routine, treading water, shading their eyes, scanning the empty horizon, trying to push back the gnawing thirst that is already becoming unbearable, telling themselves that someone has seen the distress call, that rescue will arrive before night. Chief Warrant Officer Leonard Woods stayed at his key in Radio Room 2, the backup shack aft of the bridge, until the very end, trying to punch out one last distress call on emergency battery power after the main system failed. He ordered his younger radiomen to save themselves and remained alone at his post, tapping SOS on the emergency frequency until seawater climbed high enough to drown the transmitter. He died trying to save his shipmates, and his message got through. At least 3 separate shore stations logged distress signals from the Indianapolis in those final minutes. The signals reached friendly hands. What happened next would decide the fate of hundreds of men. In a sweltering radio hut, somewhere in the Pacific, a watch officer looks at a message log with the Indianapolis's distress traffic. He weighs it against standing orders about possible Japanese deception, fake distress calls used as bait. He makes his choice: file it, don't forward it, it's probably a trap. At another station, the commanding officer has left instructions not to be disturbed. He is drunk and asleep in his quarters. The young operator copying the Indianapolis's SOS has no authority to wake him, and no standing right to bypass the chain of command. At a third station, the operators come to the same conclusion: likely enemy activity. The message is logged and ignored. So, despite Leonard Woods dying at his post to get that signal out, the distress calls that reached Allied receivers were never acted on. The Indianapolis remained unreported, unlisted, and officially unmissed. Even that failure might have been overcome if someone had simply noticed that she did not arrive where she was expected. The Indianapolis was due in Leyte Gulf at 1,100 hours on July 31st, roughly 24 hours after she actually went down. Lieutenant Stuart B. Gibson, operations officer in the port director's office at Tacloban, made a critical bureaucratic mistake. Navy policy held that the arrival of combatant ships was not to be routinely signaled, a wartime security measure meant to reduce radio traffic and deny the enemy insight into fleet movements. Gibson apparently extended that logic. If arrivals were not noteworthy, then non-arrivals were not either. When the Indianapolis did not appear at 1100 on July 31st, he noted it in his office log, and did not report it up the chain. In his mind, the ship had likely been diverted or delayed, and surely somewhere, someone knew exactly where she was. No one did. The Navy's decentralized routing system meant that no single desk had a complete, up-to-date picture of the Indianapolis: her route, her expected time of arrival, her last known position. One office knew she was due in theater, but not when. Another had received a routing dispatch garbled beyond easy decoding, and it sat, unworked. The port director at Leyte knew she was scheduled but assumed her absence was not his concern. So as the survivors entered their second day in the water, the United States Navy, the most sophisticated naval force on Earth, remained completely unaware that one of its heavy cruisers had been sunk, that 900 of its sailors and Marines were fighting for their lives in the Philippine Sea, and that their time was running out far faster than anyone afloat in that oil-slicked water could imagine. As the afternoon of July 30th wears on and the sun reaches its hottest, Dr. Haynes notices movement at the edge of his survivor group, a dark shape, sleek and deliberate, circling just beneath the surface where the oil thins and the water turns pale blue. Then he sees another. And another. Fins break the surface. In Edgar Harrell's Marine group, floating about a mile away, they see them too. At daylight we saw fins, we formed a circle and tried to keep everyone in. But some guy strayed off and you'd hear a blood-curdling scream and see him go under. The sharks have arrived. Oceanic white-tip sharks prowl these deep tropical waters, opportunistic, powerful, drawn by the echo of undersea explosions, the shock of a sinking ship, and now the great swath of blood and oil smeared across the sea. They feed on the dead first, bodies that have floated since the night before, men who died of wounds or exhaustion. But as the day passes and their confidence grows, they begin to nose at the living, circling closer, darting in on men who drift too far from the group or hover at the outer edge. Harrell watches the pattern. You'd hear a blood-curdling scream and a life jacket would go under and then pop back up to the surface. He would come back up, but you'd see fins and realize his legs were gone or he just had a torso. The sharks are terrifying. They're not the main killer out here. Exposure is. Dehydration is. And salt water itself is about to become the cruelest threat of all. By the second full day, July 31st, the craving for fresh water has become an agony. Every swallow feels like dragging broken glass over raw flesh. Lips crack and bleed. Tongues swell until men can barely speak. Mouths are so dry they cannot form saliva. Dr. Haynes moves among his men as much as the water and the fatigue will allow, begging them not to drink the sea around them. He explains that the salt will only dry them out faster, that they'll vomit, that their kidneys will shut down, that they will lose their minds and die. The younger ones don't listen. Haynes remembers, the young ones would drink salt water and get more dehydrated and become very maniacal. The progression is shockingly fast. A man takes a few mouthfuls of seawater to try to ease the burning in his throat. Within an hour he's vomiting, body fighting a losing battle against the salt now in his bloodstream. Within 2 hours his personality begins to twist. He grows restless, paranoid, quick to anger. Within 3 hours he is hallucinating. He sees islands that aren't there. He sees rescue ships on the horizon. He sees the Indianapolis, whole and riding high, as though the last 2 nights never happened. He strikes out toward those visions with desperate determination while his friends shout at him to come back. And then he is gone, lost to exhaustion, dragged under, or taken by sharks once he drifts beyond the thin safety of numbers. Those he leaves behind can only watch. By the third day, August 1st, hallucinations are no longer confined to the men who swallowed seawater. Sheer dehydration, heat stroke, and trauma are warping the minds of men who haven't had anything in their stomachs but fuel oil and their own bile for 60 hours. Some see hotels beneath the surface and try to swim down to check in. They do not return. Some see the ship, intact and close, and strike out toward it, convinced that the nightmare is over and they're about to climb the accommodation ladder for coffee and hot food. Some see their mothers, wives, children standing just beyond the oil slick, arms outstretched. They swim away from the only thing keeping them alive, the group, to reach family members who are not there. Ensign Twible, still doing everything he can to hold his large group together, watches men he has eaten and joked with for months slip into madness before his eyes. Men would swim off toward things that weren't there, we'd lose them, because they were hallucinating, and we couldn't save them because they wouldn't believe us when we told them it wasn't real. In some groups, panic and delusion turn men on each other. A few, convinced their own shipmates are Japanese in disguise, lash out violently. Fights break out in the water. Men drown each other in wild, paranoid struggles before others can pull them apart. Others surrender silently. In full view of their friends, they quietly unbuckle their life vests and slip beneath the surface without a word, too worn out and too hopeless to battle another hour. And yet, astonishingly, in the middle of this slow collapse, some men keep going. Father Thomas Conway, the ship's Catholic chaplain, continues to move among his surviving flock, offering whatever spiritual comfort he can to men on the edge of despair. His own strength is failing, but his sense of duty does not. Dr. Haynes keeps making what rounds he can manage, though he has no tools beyond his medical knowledge and his voice. He warns again and again about salt water, carefully doles out the tiny amounts of fresh water found in emergency kits, and at times physically restrains men, even striking them, if that is the only way to keep them from harming themselves. Captain McVeigh maintains what little command is left to him in his small raft group, making decisions about rationing, positioning, and survival techniques. His ship is gone. His name, though he does not know it yet, is already being prepared for public blame. He still acts as a captain. By the time the sun goes down on August 1st and the men face their fourth night adrift, their skin waterlogged and peeling, their cores chilling even in 80-degree water, their minds worn thin. The death toll has climbed to roughly 600 since the ship went down. Roughly 300 men are still alive, spread across scattered groups. Some are alert. Many are barely conscious. The water feels warm to their numb skin, but the cold has settled into their bones. The sharks are still out there, fins tracing lazy arcs. The horizon, which has been empty for 3 straight days, remains unbroken. Petty Officer Woody James, a young sailor who drifted away from Ensign Twible's group sometime during the 3rd night, now floats alone as the morning of August 2nd, the 4th full day, begins. He is too weak to shout, too tired to care much whether the next hour brings salvation or oblivion. He watches the sun rise one more time, feels the heat begin to build yet again, and closes his eyes against the glare bouncing off the oil-slick surface. Then, faintly, he hears something that does not belong in this dead stretch of ocean. The distant hum of an aircraft engine, growing louder. Lieutenant Wilbur C. Gwynn is flying his PV-1 Ventura bomber on a routine patrol, circling idly while his crew works on a bulky trailing antenna. It is 1,205 hours, 5 minutes past noon, and Gwynn is looking down at the water while the radio operator wrestles with the equipment behind him when something catches his eye. An oil slick. Not a little patch, a broad stain running across miles of ocean, dark and iridescent in the noonday sun. The kind of slick you see when a ship has dumped or lost a tremendous amount of fuel, or when one has gone down. Gwynn pushes the nose down and banks toward it. As his aircraft drops to 500 feet, he sees what the oil has been hiding. Men. Dozens. Maybe hundreds. Huddled in clusters, scattered as far as he can see. Some wave feebly at the sound of his engines. Others lie still, faces turned upward with the flat, empty look of men nearly out of strength, and out of hope. Gwynn does not hesitate. He grabs the microphone and sends the message that will, at last, after 84 hours, force the U.S. Navy to recognize that something has gone terribly wrong. Many men in the water. The rescue machinery begins to move at once. Destroyers are ordered to the spot. Additional aircraft are scrambled. A PBY Catalina amphibious flying boat, flown by Lieutenant Robert Adrian Marks, is pulled off its assigned patrol and sent to orbit the survivors and render whatever aid it can until the surface ships arrive. Those surface ships are still hours away. Marks, circling overhead at about 1,605 hours, can see plainly that some of the men below don't have hours left. He makes a decision that will define his career and, for many men in the water, the rest of their lives. He will land. It is against standing Navy orders. PBY Catalinas are not meant to land in open seas like this. The swells are too high, the aircraft too fragile. Even if he manages to get down in one piece, there is no guarantee he will ever take off again. Marks talks it over with his crew. They wanted to land to help save lives, he will later recall, and they voted unanimously that we should attempt it. So at about 1,605 hours on August 2, 1945, Marks eases his big flying boat down toward 12-foot swells in the middle of the Philippine Sea. The hull pounds against rolling whitecaps. Spray lashes the cockpit windows. He threads the PBY between scattered groups of survivors while his crew swings open the waist hatches and starts hauling men inside. The cabin fills quickly, 12 men. 15-20 bodies packed into every corner, slick with oil, half-conscious, some sobbing with relief, some too far gone to react at all. There are more men still in the water than the aircraft can hold. Marks improvises something no one has tried before. He orders his crew to secure survivors to the wings with parachute cord, tying them along the big Catalina's broad wing roots and floats, anything to keep their heads above water until the destroyers can reach them. By the time he is finished, 56 survivors are either inside the PBY or lashed to its wings. 56 men who, in all likelihood, would have died before nightfall if Lieutenant Marks had obeyed orders and stayed aloft. Even while Marks and his crew work their miracle, the main rescue operation is closing in. Around 1,700 hours, the USS Cecil J. Doyle, a destroyer escort under Lieutenant Commander W. Graham Claytor, Jr., arrives on scene at flank speed, throwing white water from her bow. Within minutes, Doyle's crew is in action, lowering boats, tossing lines, dragging exhausted men up the sides with a practiced, methodical urgency. Then night comes. As darkness threatens to slow the effort, Commander Claytor gives a risky order: switch on the Doyle's searchlight. A massive beam spears out across the tropical night. The hot glass and metal throw heat you can feel on deck. Diesel fumes drift over the water. In the circle of brilliant white light, the oil, the men, and the wreckage stand out as clear as noon. One survivor will later say, "When the searchlight from the destroyer came on, it was like God turning on a light, the darkness disappeared and suddenly we could see where we were and what was happening, and it was the most beautiful thing I've ever seen." All through the night of August 2nd and into the morning of August 3rd, the Cecil J. Doyle, joined in turn by other ships, the Ringnes, the Register, the Madison, the Ralph Talbot, work their way through the search area. They pull men aboard one by one. Some they carry like children because 4 days in the water have left their legs useless and their muscles slack. By about 1,300 hours on August 3rd, the rescue is called complete. 316 men have been saved. Out of 1,196 who left Guam 6 days earlier, 316 remain alive. A casualty rate of nearly 74%, one of the worst single-ship losses in United States Navy history. For those 316, the nightmare in the water is over. The destroyers turn toward base hospitals. Corpsmen and doctors fight to keep fragile lives from slipping away. The constant threats of drowning, sharks, and sun finally, mercifully recede. Dr. Haynes, dragged from the sea with third-degree burns on his hands and feet, salt water sores across his body, and injuries so severe that the first doctors to see him assume he will not live, will receive 11 million units of penicillin and eventually recover. He will live another 54 years. For Captain McVeigh, pulled from his raft with 8 other men, a different ordeal is only beginning. What would you have done in Captain McVeigh's place that night? Kept zigzagging in poor visibility, or trusted your judgment and run straight? Tell us what you think in the comments. 4 months later, December 1945. The war is over. Japan has surrendered. In a Washington, D.C., courtroom that smells of cigarette smoke, wood polish, and old paper, the United States Navy convenes a court-martial for Captain Charles B. McVeigh III. He is charged with 2 offenses: failure to issue a timely abandon ship order, and hazarding his vessel by failing to zigzag. The first charge collapses almost immediately. The evidence shows that McVeigh did give the abandon ship order within minutes of the first torpedo hit, and that the ship went down so fast that no conceivable order could have produced neat, disciplined evacuation. The second charge, failure to zigzag, goes forward. This, despite the fact that McVeigh's written routing orders explicitly gave him discretion to cease zigzagging when weather and visibility made it inadvisable. This, despite the fact that Admiral Chester Nimitz, Commander-in-Chief of the Pacific Fleet, has recommended that McVeigh not be court-martialed at all. Senior officials in Washington overrule Nimitz and proceed. Then they do something the Navy has never done before or since. They bring Commander Makitsura Hashimoto, the Japanese submarine captain who sank the Indianapolis, to testify against McVeigh. Hashimoto, granted special permission to travel from occupied Japan, takes the stand and answers directly. Zigzagging would not have changed the result. He had a favorable firing position. Given the ship's speed and conditions, in his professional judgment he would have hit her whether she was zigzagging or not. It is testimony from the enemy commander himself, stating plainly that the American captain on trial could not have saved his ship by zigzagging that night. The court-martial board finds McVeigh guilty anyway. The Secretary of the Navy immediately remits the sentence. McVeigh will not be imprisoned or formally punished, but the conviction stays on his record. A permanent stain on an otherwise distinguished career. The only instance in U.S. Navy history in which a captain has been court-martialed for losing his ship to enemy action. McVeigh continues to serve. He is eventually promoted to Rear Admiral and retires in 1949. The verdict never leaves him. Letters begin to come from the families of men who did not come home. Some arrive at Christmas, some on anniversaries. "Merry Christmas, our family's holiday would be a lot merrier if you hadn't killed my son." The weight of 880 dead, combined with the official judgment that, on paper, makes him the man at fault, grinds him down. His family watches him grow quieter, more withdrawn, more bitter as the years pass. On November 6, 1968, 23 years after the sinking, Captain Charles B. McVeigh III dresses carefully in his Navy uniform. He walks out onto the front porch of his home in Litchfield, Connecticut, on a cold autumn morning, carrying a small toy sailor his father once gave him. He puts a handgun to his head and pulls the trigger. That might have been where the story ended. A good officer broken under the weight of blame he did not deserve, were it not for a high school student in Florida named Hunter Scott. In the late 1990s, Scott watches the movie Jaws and hears Quint's haunting monologue about the Indianapolis. He becomes obsessed with finding out what really happened. He chooses the sinking as the subject of a National History Day project. He tracks down survivors and interviews them. He combs through Navy records. He pieces together the chain of command failures that turned a sinking into a 4-day ordeal: the absence of an escort, the flawed intelligence estimate, the mishandled distress calls, the port director's decision not to report the missed arrival. In 1999, Senator Bob Smith of New Hampshire arranges Senate Armed Services Committee hearings to revisit the Indianapolis case. Survivors come to testify: Dr. Haynes, Ensign Twible, Edgar Harrell, and others. They sit under the bright hearing room lights and tell the senators, clearly and unanimously, that Captain McVeigh was not responsible for the loss of their ship and their shipmates. Commander Hashimoto, now an old man in Japan, writes to Senator John Warner, then chairman of the committee: "Our peoples have forgiven each other for that terrible war. Perhaps it is time your peoples forgave Captain McVeigh for the humiliation of his unjust conviction." On July 13, 2001, 56 years after the sinking, 33 years after McVeigh's death, Secretary of the Navy Gordon England signs a formal letter placed in McVeigh's service record. It exonerates him. It states, in black and white, that he was not responsible for the loss of the USS Indianapolis. Too late for McVeigh to hear it, but not too late for history to be corrected. It is an official admission that the Navy's decision to single out one captain for an institutional failure was wrong. That the court-martial should never have been held. That Captain Charles B. McVeigh III was, in the end, a capable officer who made reasonable decisions in an impossible situation. Today the USS Indianapolis lies 18,000 feet down, her hull torn and scattered, her decks silent, the grave of roughly 300 men who went down with her on that July night in 1945. The 316 who survived carried the story forward for decades. They met at reunions, spoke to students and historians, and made sure the truth lived not only in official files but in living memory. Dr. Lewis Haynes lived to be 87, becoming one of the key voices preserving the medical and human realities of those 4 days before his death in 1999. Edgar Harrell, the young Marine who watched sharks circle his group for 4 long days, continued to speak publicly into his 90s, determined that the sacrifices of his shipmates would not fade into a forgotten footnote. Lieutenant Robert Adrian Marks, the PBY pilot who broke orders to land on open ocean and saved 56 men, received the Air Medal from Admiral Nimitz. He stayed in touch with the men he pulled from the water for the rest of his life. The wreck itself, located in 2017 by a private expedition funded by Paul Allen's Vulcan Incorporated, is now a protected war grave, untouchable, undisturbed, a steel tomb on the ocean floor. 12 minutes to sink. 4 days to survive. 56 years to clear a captain's name. If you value in-depth, true accounts of courage, failure, and endurance from American history, consider subscribing. We bring you new stories like this regularly with the detail and respect they deserve. For more stories of survival, resolve, and the moments that test the limits of human endurance, keep watching. Another one is waiting for you right here. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.